One of my favorite conversation threads that emerges from time to time among my Unitarian Universalist minister colleagues is cringeworthy moments in Unitarian Universalist history. One person suggested we could start with the infamous Unitarians, and then we could move on to the Unitarian Universalists we are simply embarrassed to mention. So with that said, you know where I'm going. Raised as a Universalist, David Starr Jordan graduated from Cornell University in 1872. In his 3 years there, he earned both a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science, which caused them to institute a rule that you couldn't get both at the same time anymore. 3 years later, he had earned a medical degree. He spent a decade teaching zoology and making brilliant discoveries in the study of blind cavefish. He and his students identified more than 2,000 species of fish, not all of them in caves, during his career. In 1885, he became president of Indiana University, where he implemented one of the earliest liberal arts curriculum in the United States. Just 6 years later, he became the founding president of Stanford University and the founding director of the Sierra Club. He gave himself the middle name Starr with 2 R's after Thomas Starr King, a famous Unitarian minister, sometimes credited with keeping California as a free state rather than a slave state. David Starr Jordan was brilliant and effective and deeply committed to excellence in higher education. He steered Stanford through financial crisis and the aftermath of the 1906 earthquake. He raised money for the ACLU to put on the defense of the Scopes monkey trial. He worked diligently for world peace. He advocated widely. He had 18 books published by the American Unitarian Association, was one of the most popular speakers in the early 1900s, advocated widely for a religion that takes scientific knowledge as seriously as our direct spiritual experience and tradition. We see that legacy today. We are that tradition. And that was the first shoe, this is the other shoe. In 1900, he wrote a book published by the American Unitarian Association called Blood of a Nation. And with a title like that in 1900, you know it's not going to be good. Every single one of the 33 years he spent in higher education, he gave a course of lectures on why eugenics was critically important to prevent race mixing and preserve the greatness of this Anglo-Saxon nation. He dressed it up in academic language and scientific discourse. But what he said was that it was imperative to begin a program of eugenics and forced sterilization to preserve Anglo-Saxons. The purpose of the study of eugenics, he wrote, is to know the kind of ancestors we should pick for the next generation. Careful on who "we" is in that sentence. He said, there are 2 consequences. The first piece of that work is encouraging a tendency towards wiser mating on the part of men and women of intelligence and education. The second effort is the limitation by public authority of reproduction for the defective, the insane, and the criminal. He went on to say things like, survival of the unfittest is the primal cause of the downfall of nations. He wrote, regrettably, of the heat of the tropics, the warmth of tropics around the world, which allowed people to live long enough to reproduce, who he said ought to have died earlier. Cringeworthy moments in Unitarian Universalist history. A person's resume obviously can be written and read in a lot of different ways. And what are we to do with that complexity David Starr Jordan was ludicrously, absurdly racist. David Starr Jordan profoundly, unambiguously shaped American higher education for the better. What do we do with the fact that he did all sorts of good in the world and all sorts of profound bad? He made higher education one of the engines of democracy in this nation and spent most of his academic career dressing up bigotry in the clothing of academic justification. Well, I don't pretend to have all the answers to how to deal with all of that. But I've got a starting point for sure, and that's to tell the whole story without avoiding or denying the ugly, horrible parts of it. Here's what not to do. In an entry on Jordan in the online Unitarian Universalist biographical database, an otherwise really excellent online resource, there's a 2,000-word entry on Jordan. By comparison, I've got about 1,600 words for you today. In that 2,000-word entry, there are 118 on his racism. And let me read it to you in full. In a section talking about his pacifism and its virtue, the author says Jordan's pacifist convictions were in part based on the pseudoscience of eugenics. It's really hard to do this without sarcasm. He believed that war destroyed the best of humanity, leaving the weaker members of society to produce the next generation. He nevertheless did not support the more radical implications of eugenics. The artificial breeding of the Superman, he said, would defeat its own ends. It would breed out of existence the two most important factors the race has won: love and initiative. That is how formal, academic, journalistic language conceals reality. It wasn't that Jordan thought whites were superior and that the Anglo-Saxon should not meet the Negro, the Indian, the Mexican as fellow citizens equal before the law. It wasn't that. It was merely that his great virtue of pacifism happened to be based on some pseudoscientific views. In this sort of a biography, he isn't particularly awful. After all, breeding a Superman would mean breeding out love and initiative, and to him, those were the most important things, the values, surely, that we share too. The UU biographical database is noteworthy not for the way that it talks about him, but for its ordinariness, in how that entry on him mirrors the way we talk about so many great men of history. It's notable for its ordinary erasure or omission, maybe from shame or embarrassment. It's notable for its omission of the infamous. Jordan provided, through his work and his students, the so-called scientific justification for California's 1909 forced sterilization law, a law not repealed until the 1970s, under which more than 20,000 men and women in mental hospitals and prisons were sterilized against their will and often without their knowledge, so that their inferior blood would not be passed on. And in the 1930s, California's sterilization law became a model for sterilization laws passed in Nazi Germany. So our work first is to tell a more complete, a more nuanced story of our ancestors. That's the good and the bad and the ugly. Telling the whole story means that we don't defend the bad behavior, we don't minimize or justify. It's so tempting to say that Jordan's eugenics, that racist interest, was just a product of its time. Evolution was a new branch of science. Jordan's his real interest was to promote the common welfare, was to promote the flourishing of a country not even 150 years old. How could he have known better? Why, indeed, should we even dwell on his racism at all, given we all know how bad it is? The authors Rita Nakashima-Brock and Rebecca Parker, I return to them often. They've written, "We cannot lament and we cannot transform what we reject or deny and refuse to engage. How can we grieve the suffering that is real if we pretend not to see it? How can we transform the everyday language that conceals injustices all the time, everywhere, right now, if we don't name them and their reality?" So, okay, we tell the whole story. We don't defend the bad behavior. We don't justify it or minimize it or avoid it. This is very uncomfortable, but the next thing to do, I think, is not to try to balance the scales. Because often, I know that my own reflexive instinct, reading about a guy like this, is to render judgment. I want to render judgment. I want to put all the good things over here, and I want to put all the bad things over here, and I want to figure out where it all lies, and kind of put a letter grade on that, right? Abraham Lincoln, A+, clearly. David Starr Jordan, I don't know, D-? Like, what? I'm not sure where that shakes out. But that's not the task. That's not the task. That's about, in some ways, that's about conflict avoidance. Once I've assigned this person good or bad, I have to deal with the complexity of it and more. It's also, I think, about our own internal instinct toward perfectionism, right? Our heroes ought to be all good or all bad, but not all complicated. Our task instead is to hold it all without celebration, without fear. It's to do this work, this circle, triangle, square work, to say, yes, the fact that there's a circle there does not remove the reality of the square over there. Part of what this image does for me is it takes away, it counsels against the impulse to essentialize, to say that this whole person ought to be boiled down into one label, good, bad, indifferent. But there is no essentializing. The good things that Jordan did don't have to be false for the bad things to be true. In 2019 and 2020 at Stanford, as the movement for Black Lives reshaped the conversation in the country, a group of students and professors and administrators gathered to ask this question: what are we going to do with David Starr Jordan, our founding president whose name shows up on buildings and streets and classrooms? And in part, one of their conclusions was that what is essential is to tell a more complete and nuanced story. Our first principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every person, not the inherent worth and dignity of every person's actions, not the inherent worth and dignity of every person's weird, racist, eugenic belief. The inherent worth and dignity of their person. Was Jordan a bad person? It's not my job to parse that. He did things which clearly violated the inherent worth and dignity of others. I'm not here to judge his soul or spirit or something, but to name his actions and their impact and tell a nuanced story. But in that process, the third piece of counsel I'd offer is not to descend into outrage. It is so sweet and delicious and wonderful to be righteous and right and explain loudly to the rest of the world how they're all idiots. I mean, even if you feel guilty, it feels good too, right? But that's not telling a nuanced story. That's just the opposite. Instead of saying the person's all good, it's saying they're all bad. It's not about making that sort of a judgment. I think this is part of the essential question when people talk about cancel culture, which gets thrown around now, weaponized. The question that's really underneath that, the real canceling question, the sharp question is, who will our heroes be? And will we be honest about it? We get to choose, seeing all of the complexity, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We get to choose, does that statue stay on the pedestal? Does his name stay on the building? Do we honor and celebrate our heroes? I think so often, though, it's tempting, it's easy to fall into the trap of not just saying, no, that name should come off the building, but of gleefully and joyfully and sweetly and deliciously being righteous and right in a world full of people who just don't get it. I think those two things get conflated. They get woven and wound together. And sometimes I see people reactive to notions of cancel culture, but it's become a caricature. The loudest voices yelling down everyone else, that's a caricature of the sharp question, which is, who will our heroes be and what story will we tell about them? The question of how we hold all of this in others is also about how we hold the story we tell about our own life, our own selves. The sharp question is one that reflects back on us again. The work we're trying to do with these forebears is also work we need to apply to ourselves, to be honest with ourselves in telling the whole story of our whole lives. That we've got some good and we've got some bad, and we don't need to minimize or justify the bad, and we don't need to look at the good as if that's the end of who we really are. We've got to hold it lightly. We are, as we say so often, a promise-making people, and that's good, and a promise-breaking people, and that's bad, and a promise-remaking people, and that's complicated. Our work, in the same way that we turn it out into the world, is not to rise into personal zealotry of how great and right and wonderful we are, not to take the bait that we're either perfect or we're broken, not to descend into despair. When we give ourselves permission to see the ways that our heroes were imperfect, we give ourselves permission to face our own imperfection too. Although having said that, none of you should go out and start doing eugenics. That's an extra step. We face the past in order to face the present. And wrestling with Jordan's legacy gives us practice wrestling with our own legacy. And it lets us take a deep collective breath. We're people, we miss the mark. We can begin again and choose differently. Our ancestors weren't broken irredeemably, they were complicated. And you're not broken either. But we are complicated. The writer Annie Dillard reads Psalm 24 from the Hebrew Scriptures, which says that only those with clean hands and pure hearts are worthy to ascend the hill of the Lord, which you could interpret as only those who are pure of heart, perfectly clean, perfectly pure, are worthy enough to be in the presence of the holy. She reads that and goes a real different direction, and I close with her words. She says, "Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? Who shall stand in his holy place? There is no one but us. There's no one to send, nor a clean hand, nor a pure heart on the face of the earth, nor in the earth, but only us. A generation comforting ourselves with the notion that we have come at an awkward time, that our innocent fathers are dead, as if innocence had ever been, our children are busy and troubled, and we ourselves unfit, not yet ready, having each of us chosen wrongly, made a false start, failed, yielded to impulse and the tangled comfort of pleasures, and grown exhausted, unable to seek the thread, weak, involved. But there is no one but us, she says. There never has been. There have been generations which remembered it and generations which forgot. But there's never been a generation of whole people who lived well even one day. And yet some have imagined well with honesty and art the detail of such a life and have described it with such grace that we mistake vision for history and dream for description and fancy that life has devolved. So, you learn this, studying any history at all, especially the lives of artists and visionaries. You learn it from Emerson, who noticed that the meanness of our days is itself worthy of thought. And you learn it, I hope, fitful in your pew in church. Amen.